stimulus ekonomi?
Stimulus yang baru aja diumumkan saya rasa mengarah ke arah yang benar, dan tentunya langkah yang mungkin satu yang bisa diperhatikan adalah peningkatan likuiditas di ekonomi. Ini penting sekali, bahwasanya likuiditas ini sangat kurang karena uang beredar terhadap PDB atau ekonomi di Indonesia ini masih hanya sekitar 45%, mengingat negara-negara maju itu uang beredar terhadap PDB-nya itu bisa melebihi 200%. Jadinya pengalihan likuiditas ke perbankan, dan syukur-syukur ini bisa lebih ditingkatkan lagi dengan pendatangan modal dari luar lewat penanaman modal asing. Ini akan membantu untuk porsi uang beredar untuk terus meningkat, dan itu tentunya akan jauh lebih bagus untuk kewirausahaan ke depan.
Oke.
Saya di kubu yang percaya bahwa dalam waktu dekat mudah-mudahan akan terjadi kesepakatan antara Tiongkok dengan Amerika untuk kepentingan hubungan perdagangan dan ekonomi, dan apabila ini terjadi tentunya ini akan lebih baik untuk Asia Tenggara, karena semestinya tidak akan terjadi pembanjiran barang dan jasa dari Tiongkok, mengingat Tiongkok itu kental sekali dengan overcapacity, yang mana barang dan jasa ya, ini sangat harus dilempar oleh Tiongkok kemanapun. Tapi kedepannya saya rasa PR untuk Indonesia adalah untuk bagaimana terus bisa meningkatkan produktivitas agar kita lebih bisa bersaing untuk penjualan atau perdagangan barang dan jasa dengan atau ke siapapun dan manapun. Dan juga langkah yang diambil oleh Indonesia untuk melakukan diversifikasi, termasuk dengan masuknya Indonesia ke perkumpulan BRICS pada tanggal 6 Januari tahun 2025, itu juga adalah tanda bahwasanya langkah yang sudah dan akan terus diambil oleh Indonesia adalah untuk mencari pasar baru, dan tentunya BRICS ini merupakan bagian dari opsi-opsi yang ada untuk negara-negara berkembang seperti Indonesia. Tapi bukan berarti Indonesia tidak akan terus bekerja sama dengan Amerika atau negara-negara barat lainnya. Tapi saya rasa diversifikasi itu bagian yang sangat alamiah untuk negara berkembang besar seperti Indonesia ke depan. Dan tentunya peningkatan produktivitas ini sangat krusial untuk kita bisa meningkatkan daya saing, agar kita lebih bisa bukan hanya meningkatkan proses diversifikasi, tapi juga bisa meningkatkan perdagangan intra ASEAN yang sampai hari ini masih kurang terlalu besar, mengingat angka perdagangan intra di Asia Tenggara itu tidak lebih dari kurang lebih 23-24% dari nilai ekonomi kolektif di Asia Tenggara. Perekonomian Asia Tenggara itu 4 triliun dolar, tapi perdagangan satu sama lain di Asia Tenggara itu nggak lebih dari 1 triliun dolar. Ini sangat jauh lebih kecil secara persentase dibandingkan intra-trade atau perdagangan intra di kubu atau perkumpulan seperti Eropa yang melebihi 60% dari nilai ekonomi di Eropa. PR-nya sudah kelihatan dan sudah mulai dilakukan. Insya Allah kita akan bisa lebih bersaing ke depan.
Yeah,
Sure. Ever since the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, I think it's almost a given that the United States, and to some extent other members of the West, have been on this general trend of having embarked on an ill campaign to spread liberal values all across the world, most particularly members of the Global South. And this would have been filled with distortions and to some extent hypocrisy, as if they're in this perennial state of being able to write and rewrite history. And this does not resonate well to most members of the Global South, to the extent that revisionism has been inevitable, coming from members of BRICS, ostensibly pioneered by China, and other members of the Global South. The appeal of this revisionism is ever increasing to members of the Global South. I speak for a Global South member called Indonesia, and I also speak for most members of Southeast Asia, which earn less than $13,205 per capita per year. That's the threshold for modernity. On the back of all this, I'm in a camp that believes that in spite of the revisionism, I think China and the West, particularly the US, are likely to become indispensable inevitabilities for the next 50 to 100 years. And that is good for Southeast Asia, because those are well-needed countervailing forces as to provide the well-needed peace and stability for Southeast Asia, as opposed to what we experienced in the 17th century on the back of that absence of countervailing force from China, which resulted in the 3.5 centuries of humiliation in most parts of Southeast Asia. Going forward, I think there are structural challenges with respect to Southeast Asia. If you take a look at the longitudinal poles of Southeast Asia from Nanway to Merauke, Nokmong to Boa, longitudinally 5,000 kilometers, latitudinally 4,000 kilometers. Those are equivalent to the distances of Los Angeles to Boston, Tehran to London. Despite the immensity and diversity of Southeast Asia, we're oftentimes identified as not great storytellers. We don't tell stories as well as we should. And this is empirically evidenced in that there's only about 375,000 books written about Southeast Asia in the context of about 140 million books. That's 0.26% of all publications available. For a region that represents about 700 million, equivalent to about 9% of the global population. So the challenge going forward is, how does Southeast Asia improve upon its pre-existing cognitive capacity? I think the structural reason as to why there is a widening economic divergence in Southeast Asia is largely and structurally because of the educational divergence within Southeast Asia. You just take a look at the PISA scores of Southeast Asian countries. Singapore is at the top of the world, top Southeast Asia. Vietnam is number 2 in Southeast Asia, has surpassed the global average, whereas the other 8 countries in Southeast Asia are still below the global average. You take a look at the tertiary education. There's 8,000 universities in Southeast Asia with 19 million students, whereas 2,600 universities in China with 39 million students. Only one university in Southeast Asia places in the top 20. So from a non-tertiary and tertiary standpoint, there is ostensible divergence. This is correlated with the economic divergence that's staring at us. Now, this is a structural challenge, particularly in the context of evolutionary processes as they relate to geopolitics, economics, technology, and climate. To the extent that the evolution is and likely to become more exponential, the more Southeast Asia needs to be more cohesive and collective. The more Southeast Asia needs to work on reducing the educational divergence as to reduce the economic divergence. The future for Southeast Asia, in my view, is to look at China in spite of the massive economic relations, more for technological allocation purposes. Because Chinese technology is a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper. People in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, they cannot afford iPhones. They can only afford Huawei's and Oppo's. Singaporeans can afford iPhones. because they earn $91,000 per capita per year, whereas the people in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, they earn less than $2,000 per year, whereas those in Indonesia only earn $5,000 per year. On the back of that, in addition to looking at China increasingly for technological capital allocation purposes, I think the West is a natural economic capital allocator by way of the fact that they've quantitatively eased their economies as to create about $140 trillion worth of liquidity that hasn't gotten diversified out to the global South. Why? Because of two structural attributes. The first is the lack of rule of law, which Singapore has, which most members of the global South do not have. The second is the lack of wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks. Uncertainties are unknown unknowns, whereas risks are known unknowns. Stuff that can be priced, measured, quantified, and predicted. So I do see trends which are presenting both challenges and opportunities, but I do believe that Southeast Asia has its work cut out in the next few decades on the back of this massive educational divergence.